Hello. I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I have the pleasure of being the president of the American Academy in Berlin. And it's a big pleasure, and I'm particularly delighted to welcome you all tonight to our very first Fellows presentation of the spring semester of 2022. And as the pandemic has reminded us of how precious human contact actually is, let me just add how pleased I am that we can meet together here at the Hans Arnold Center. Tonight we will hear a talk on The Art of Betrayal, Translation in an Age of Suspicion by our Spring 2022 Berlin Prize Fellow and award-winning writer and translator Tess Lewis. I want to begin by thanking the benefactors who have made this fellowship and this program possible. The Max Kade Foundation, Academy trustee Dirk Ippen, the C.H. Beck Stiftung, the Fondation Charles Heimhoff, Martin Kuhler, Sidra Stich, and Jens Odewald. We are deeply grateful for your generosity. Thank you very much. I also want to say how delighted I am that this evening with Tess Lewis is happening. And let me make a not-so-dramatic confession. Tess is a friend of many years. Shall we say many years? Would that be the appropriate formulation? Tess is vastly younger than I am, but we both studied at different times at the same obscure institution in England, and I've been reading her and benefiting from her incredible passion for literature all this time. And for those of a suspicious inclination, and we are talking tonight about an age of suspicion, I did not solicit her application to the Academy nor exert any pressure whatsoever on the selection committee, something I would never do, because I just have very good taste in friends, and that was wholly unnecessary. Anyway, I am not the introducer here, so let me just add in passing that during her fellowship in Berlin, Tess Lewis will work on her translation of the acclaimed Wenderoman, one of the most acclaimed Wenderoman in contemporary German literature, Stern. Do we say Stern 111 or Stern 111? Okay. There are a lot of different things that get covered in translation. Anyway, Stern 111, Stern 111 by Lutz Seiler, the winner of the 2020 Leipzig Book Prize. My job instead is to welcome the person who will introduce Tess to you and help moderate this evening's question and answer. Isabel Fargo Cole is a novelist and a translator of German. Born in Illinois, she came to Berlin in 1995 to study German and Russian literature at the Humboldt University, and to our good fortune, she decided to make Berlin her home and has lived here ever since. Isabel Fargo Cole has won numerous awards for her writing and translations, including the prestigious Helen and Kurt Wolff Translation Prize, which she won in 2018 for her translation of the late Wolfgang Hilbig's surrealist short story Alte Abdeckerei. In addition to several other works by Hilbig, she has translated into English works by such writers as Franz Fuhrmann, Friedrich Dürrenmatt, Anna-Maria Schwarzenbach, Hermann Unger, and Adalbert Stifter. So in addition to her many translations, Isabel Fargo Cole is also a novelist of distinction, and an unusual one at that, since she is an American who writes her novels in German. As Der Spiegel put it, it is not just the fact that she writes in German, or the fact that she writes in German is not as important as how she writes in German, namely with an atmospheric and precise style that is a testament to her mastery of prose. Let me just say I am in awe of this Nabokovian feat. Her 2017 debut novel, Die Grüne Grenze, is about a young family that moves from Berlin to the eastern side of the Innerdeutsche Grenze, the inner German border, in 1973. It was nominated for the Klaus Michael Kühne Prize, as well as the Leipzig Book Fair Prize. Her second novel, Das Gift der Biene, was published in 2019, and in it we follow the experiences of a young woman, young American woman I might add, living with artists and other squatters in an occupied house in 1990s East Berlin. That milieu now seems hard to conjure, indeed almost mythical when we consider how much Berlin has changed since that time. Das Gift der Biene was selected to be one of the competing works in that year's prestigious Literatur Nord reading series competition. Isabel, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here and to do the honors now. The virtual podium is yours, the real one as well.
Is it okay with both mics, or will there be interference? Okay, good. Yes, thank you so much. Right, forgot about that. Thank you so much, Daniel Benjamin, for that generous introduction, and I'm really honored to be here, and especially to be introducing one of my most respected translator colleagues. Tess Lewis has for years been a key figure in the American translation field, and also an astute and generous facilitator and bringer together of literary voices and translation talents. To begin at the beginning, in an interview, Tess once gave a very unusual reply to the question, "What did you want to be when you were young?" Her answer was not an astronaut or a veterinarian or a poet, but an editor. However, her fascination with literary translation was also ignited early on in high school. She reminisced, "A friend gave me a copy of Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, and the universe it opened up to me was so unexpected, so strange, awe-inspiring, and captivating, so unlike anything I'd read before, certainly unlike any English or American fiction I'd come across, that it turned me into a passionate explorer of these alternate universes." At this time of heightened tension with Russia, I was moved to learn that Bulgakov's marvelous book was what set you on your path as a translator. Tess continued exploring these alternate universes with an education in France and Austria, ultimately getting a degree in comparative literature at Oxford University, and there realizing that her vocation lay in translation. Since then, she has established herself as a leading translator of French authors such as Philippe Jacotet and Christine Angot, venerable German writers such as Peter Handke, Walter Benjamin, and Hans Magnus Enzensberger, and newer German voices like Lutz Seiler, mentioned before, Maja Haderlap, and Lukas Bärfuß. Most recently, she's translated The Notes by Ludwig Hohl, the magnum opus of that long-neglected Swiss writer. She has received or been shortlisted for nearly every conceivable honor in the translation field, with grants from PEN USA, PEN UK, the National Endowment for the Arts, a Max Geilinger Translation Grant, the ACFNY Translation Prize, the 2017 PEN Translation Prize, and most recently, a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship. Very admirably, she takes time away from her own work to champion and foster literary translation and translators. In the 1990s, she served on the board of the National Book Critics Circle and used her position to successfully lobby for the inclusion of translated fiction in their awards. Currently, she's a member of the PEN Translation Committee. For years, she's acted as advisory editor for the Hudson Review, and in 2014, 15, and 21, she curated New York's Festival Neue Literatur, a celebration of writers from a wide range of German-language regions. In numerous essays and talks, Tess Lewis has developed her own strong writing voice. She eloquently shares her insights into the nuances of translation and reflects on her interest in broader, related issues such as the role of regional dialects and linguistic minorities. Quote, "I'm particularly drawn to writing that is deeply rooted in local customs, conventions, institutions, and linguistic and cultural traditions, a counterpart of sorts to the smooth, global literature that could come from anywhere. To me, much of the most exciting and innovative writing in any language takes place on the margins." For Tess, translation is an act of intimacy as well as an act of responsibility, a responsibility that we'll be reflecting on this evening. Keenly attuned to the creative, dynamic nature of translation and the ambiguities it entails, she describes the translator as a kind of Penelope, continually unraveling and reweaving the work of the writer. I'm looking forward to the threads she'll weave in our talk and in our conversation tonight.
Thank you, Isabel, for that very gracious introduction. Before I start, I'd like to thank Daniel Benjamin and his marvelous staff at the American Academy, as well as the Academy's many generous supporters for offering such a rich environment for all of us fellows to work in. I'm particularly grateful to the librarian Ilya Uring, who pulls books off shelves all over Germany like rabbits from a hat. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight or tuning in. One last and heartfelt thanks to those friends who could not be with us tonight because they are helping resettle refugees from Ukraine. Most of my lecture was written before the invasion, and I find that some of the issues that I address in my talk are all the more urgent. We're witnessing firsthand the very real danger done, or the very real damage done when language is co-opted, manipulated, and silenced. And now, for the art of betrayal. In the spring of 1970, the American Pen Translation Committee convened a week-long conference in New York City on the world of translation. It brought together dozens of eminent translators, writers, and poets, including Gregory Rabassa, Irving Howe, Isaac Bashevis Singer, and Muriel Rukeyser, among others. The committee's manifesto opened with a call for action. For too long, they proclaimed, translators have been the lost children in the enchanted forest of literature. Their names are usually forgotten, they are grotesquely underpaid, and their services, however skillfully rendered, are regarded with the slightly patronizing and pitying respect formerly reserved for junior housemaids. In the 5 decades since, some progress has been made in the Anglophone world of translation. Translators' names increasingly appear on the cover, even on the front and not just hidden in the small print on the back flap, thanks to efforts by the Pen Translation Committee and most recently Jennifer Croft, although you'll see that only 2 of the 6 titles chosen somewhat at random have my name on the front. Sometimes it's on the back. And critics and reviewers are slightly less inclined to forget that when they praise a particular author's exquisite or innovative style, the English version is comprised, strictly speaking, of someone else's words. Although translated fiction is ever more an afterthought for the largest American publishing houses, more than a dozen small presses devoted exclusively or primarily to works in translation have been founded in the United States and Britain, even Berlin, in the last 20 years, and international prizes recognizing works in translation have gained in prominence and purses. And finally, although the profession is still grotesquely underpaid, translators are granted royalties somewhat less grudgingly than before, and there are more stipends and grants available to them now than perhaps ever have been. As for the respect granted translators, it has generally increased, as I hope it has for junior housemates. In some universities, for example, translations are now accepted as publications in tenure packets. And although works in translation constitute a negligible percentage of the books that it reviews, the New York Times maintains a website called Globetrotting, which offers a sneak preview of 75 to 100 books in translation to look out for each year. Nonetheless, the respect that translators do receive is ambivalent. Although now less colored by pity and condescension, this respect is still tainted with a degree of suspicion that is inseparable from the fetishization of the perfect translation. Esther Allen has pointed out the translator's dilemma, noting that, quote, conventional wisdom both disparages them for being mere copyists and mistrusts them for not being mere copyists, end quote. Quite aside from the fact that exact equivalence is replication, not translation, there is no one true definitive translation for any work. Some translations are better than others, to be sure, and some translations are egregiously bad. Each language is a world unto itself, and has been at least since the destruction of the Tower of Babel. It may share certain territories or weather systems with others, but it is not, nor ever can be, identical to another. As Emily Apter pointed out in her introduction to the Dictionary of Untranslatables, quote, "Nothing is exactly the same in one language as in another, so the failure of translation is always necessary and absolute. Apart from its neglect of the fact that some pretty good equivalencies are available, this proposition rests on a mystification, on a dream of perfection we cannot even want, let alone have," end quote. Translation's necessary and absolute failure, often used as an excuse to dismiss translated literature as not really the author's work or as a justification for intellectual provincialism and complacency, is in fact a primary source of its richness and value. Every translation is founded on an interpretation. In fact, George Steiner says every act of reading and every act of communication is an act of interpretation. The translator brings her entire background to bear, her life experiences, travel, and reading history, her intuition and her vocabulary, beautifully captured in the German word Wortschatz, or word hoard. In short, her entire autography, as Michael Hoffman puts it, is at play. At the risk of appearing to shift the blame for any infelicities or infidelities in my own translation, I'll go a step further than Emily Apter and maintain that the endeavor to transfer a text from one language into another is doomed from the start, not only because languages are discrepant, but all the more so because treachery is rooted in the most basic element of our medium, the word. Words are inconstant things. A single word can harbor multiple meanings, even directly contradictory ones, as in the case of oversight or peer. Then there are homophones, which function like audible sliding doors. On top of that, personal associations and nuances accrue to words over the course of each speaker's lifetime. And if that weren't enough, the meaning of words can change over time and depending on the context. Until the 18th century, for example, the word nice, according to the OED, was almost exclusively derogatory, meaning foolish, absurd, wanton, dissolute, lazy, ostentatious, but also elegant, precise, or fastidious. In the past 300 years, however, its meaning has shifted 180 degrees to the laudatory senses of respectable, cultured, virtuous, decent, pleasant, good-natured, attractive, and so on. The novel Elsewhere, by the Austrian writer Doron Rabinovich, which I translated a decade ago, offers an amusing object lesson in the precarious variability of words. The protagonist, Ethan Rosen, is a brilliant sociologist, born in Tel Aviv to Holocaust survivors, but raised in Vienna. He's fluent in a half a dozen languages, writes scholarly articles and polemical op-ed pieces on both sides of the fault lines between Israeli and European cultures. He's a reflexive oppositionist, a reverse chameleon, never more Israeli than in Austria, never more Austrian than in Tel Aviv. When his comments in an Israeli newspaper lambasting organized tours of concentration camp museums are quoted in an Austrian newspaper by an academic rival, who attributes them only to a well-known Israeli intellectual, Ethan does not recognize his own words and responds in outrage. The controversy spins out of control. It really is very funny. There's an amusing side plot involving an ultra-Orthodox rabbi's failed attempt to clone a Messiah from the DNA of a purported descendant of David and Solomon from the house of Judah, which, in its attempt to recode an original from an original, also seems to me to be an apt illustration of translation's quest. Truth, in Rabinovich's novel, as an everyday experience, especially politics, is relative and inscrutable. Like meaning, it changes depending on who speaks it and where and when it's spoken. In short, truth with a capital T, like meaning with a capital M, is always elsewhere, although more or less accurate versions of it are just in reach. One ongoing effort to pin down the unstable entity that is translation involves finding metaphors or analogies for it. This epistemological parlor game has resulted in a list that is long is still growing. Isabel mentioned my Penelope one. The examples are instructive, even if limited. Among them, we have the translator as a dog on a short or a long leash, the translator as a musician interpreting a score, or a composer transposing a work for a different instrument. The translator is also compared to a landscape painter using a different color palette, a chef making a particular dish with substitute ingredients, an actor playing a role, a messenger who garbles the message, a ventriloquist, even a simple pane of glass. There are metaphors for the act of translation, such as trying to catch an eel in one pond and put it in another, or working in a hall of mirrors, or kissing through a veil. These metaphors capture isolated aspects of translational metamorphosis, but not the full spectrum of the art's instability and variability. As a counter or complement, I'd like to suggest photography as emblematic of translation. By anchoring its subject in time and physical matter, film or screen, photography is a suspenseful kind of translation. In a photograph, as in a translation, an elusive, multifarious whole is pinned down in two dimensions, in a certain place, at a certain time, but in a shifting present from the viewer's perspective. A translation, like a photograph, is a likeness of the original subject, to be sure, but the subject, the text, is perceived from a specific angle, the translator's cultural and personal background, her reading and education, and it is seen in a certain light, the original language and cultural context, then reproduced in another, at a specific shutter speed, in color or black and white. Like photography, translation entails a moment of suspense, both in the sense of anticipation and suspension, in the journey of an idea, a whole, a vision, between two media, and more importantly, the transfiguration from the metaphysical to the physical. But the journey doesn't end there, for readers, like viewers, bring their own assumptions and interpret accordingly. So now that I've led you on to the unstable foundations of translation and pointed out how unreliable the construction material is, I'm not going to abandon you, but hope to reclaim a firmer footing by exploring the essential questions. Can we trust translations, and why should we? There's a passage in one of my recent translations that succinctly sums up the translator's quandary. It's from a collection of microfictions by the young Swiss writer Judith Keller called The Questionable Ones. In these short texts, Keller delves into the aporia of language by taking idiomatic expressions literally, unpacking multiple meanings of words, and confounding expectations. By training her eye on a single word and peeling back the layers of associations and assumptions that have congealed around them, she unlocks metaphysical trapdoors. Here, she takes on fidelity, and I'll let German speakers in the audience read the originals on the slides and only read the English. Fidelity. In being true to him, she's afraid she's not being true to herself. She doesn't know if she would like to be true to herself. It's not clear to her, then, to whom she should be true. The first question to be asked, in the endless, sometimes tedious, sometimes fruitful debate over faithfulness in translation is, faithful to what or to whom? To the original language, to the target or host language, to the writer's voice with all its particularities and idiosyncrasies or lack of them, to the translator's interpretation or own idiolect? In being too narrowly true to the original text, too literal, let's say, the translator can hardly be true to her understanding or interpretation of the original. On the other hand, indulging too much in her own autography inevitably does a disservice to the original. This is complicated by the fact that some authors welcome their translators' intrusions or betrayal upwards. Borges, who was well-versed in English and in Anglo-Saxon poetry, told his translator, Ben Bellet, quote, "Simplify me, modify me, make me stark. My language often embarrasses me. It's too youthful, too Latinate. I want the power of Kinewolf, Beowulf, Bede. Make me macho and gaucho and skinny," end quote. Despite his strong preference for the condensed elemental power of Old English words, Borges recognized the riches the English language's double inheritance contributed to its word hoard. As a result of the Roman, Viking, and Norman invasions, English not only has a larger number of words than French or German, double by some counts, but it's impossible to quantify this precisely. It has two distinct registers: the blunt earthiness of Anglo-Saxon words and the more abstract Latinate words. Exploiting the tension between them, shifting from one to the other within a sentence, is a useful tool for conveying irony and humor in English that German and French achieve primarily by other stylistic means. You use all the resources that your language has to offer. I'd like to present a few examples from my translations to illustrate some of the strategies and resources that I've employed and deployed in order to remain faithful to the original text and my experience of it. And I hope that they will go some way to restoring faith in the reliability of translators and their works that I may have shaken with my previous remarks. First, I'd like to look at issues of tone and syntax. I leaned heavily on an abstract intellectual register when translating Jonas Löscher's novel Kraft, a satire of neoliberal values and Silicon Valley hubris. The protagonist, Richard Kraft, is a German professor of rhetoric and aging Reaganite who is heavily in debt and unhappily married. Now that he is down on his luck, he has begun having second thoughts about the supply-side economics he once championed very much against the grain in Germany in the 80s and 90s as the only viable system. Nonetheless, Kraft enters an essay competition sponsored by a Silicon Valley tycoon, confident that he can make the winning case for supporting optimism in our technological era in answer to the prompt, why whatever is right, and why we can still improve it. The $1 million prize will solve both his financial and marital woes. Löscher's style in this book is self-consciously, luxuriantly, and intricately cerebral. His sentences reenact the convolutions of Kraft's reasoning and the contortions he has to put himself through to compromise his relatively newfound principles and quiet doubts that have nagged him even before he entered the contest. The first trap in the novel was the title, Kraft. The protagonist's name means power, strength, force, energy, effect, ability, vitality, virility, and so on. And the book is filled with puns of the word's many meanings. I had a long discussion with the editor about whether to translate Richard Kraft as Richard Power, but to avoid associations with the far better-known American novelist Richard Powers, and because the puns on Kraft were too multivalent to be covered by any one of the English alternatives, we kept the name in German. There is, incidentally, a very funny scene involving terroir, macaroni, and cheese, but it seemed better to ignore possible associations with the food product known as Kraft mac and cheese. So, you do what you can. In this passage, Richard Kraft is despairing over his inability to formulate an answer to the essay. A literal version of the opening clause, "There is only a little Kraft left in him," is awkward and disrupts the flow, so I decided to indicate his deflation with "but a shadow of himself." Kraft is but a shadow of himself at this point. He's had to eat a lot of crow on this trip. Now he can see it all through to the end and thus definitively turn his back on his convictions. And the German speakers among you can see how I tried to capture the archness and irony implicit in the German with a shift in registers between eating crow and Kraft turning his back on his convictions rather than the more literal turning his back on himself. And next, I have a brief example of how Löscher's sentences reflect Kraft's logical flailings, complete with a play on his name. The best of these passages go on for pages, but I didn't want to tax your patience too much, so I've chosen one of the shortest. The literal version, "Fat chance Kraft knows what he has to do. Doubts come faster than he is able to marshal the previous night's euphoria into a consistent train of thought. He laboriously tries to recover last night's feeling, and when that proves impossible, he attempts to do it through pragmatism and systematic thought because, if he remembers correctly, the energy that filled him in Mackenzie's room came from exactly that source. Tatkraft, in the last sentence, as energy, is one of the elusive puns on the character's name. This version is too wordy and unwieldy, so I rearranged the clauses and put signposts in for the reader. For example, the clarifying what that source refers to. So the more polished version, fat chance Kraft knows what he has to do. Doubts come faster than he's able to marshal the previous night's euphoria into a consistent train of thought. Failing euphoria, he struggles instead to grasp the thread through pragmatism and systematic thought because, if he remembers correctly, the energy that had filled him in Mackenzie's room was nothing if not pragmatic and systemic. These are not huge changes, but I believe the second version, though less literal, better conveys the tortuous elegance of the narrative. These considerations and adjustments are what I'm referring to when I talk about trying to recreate my experiences of the original text for the English reader. Now, I'd like to turn to problems of word choice and semantics. Translators approach Walter Benjamin with great trepidation, not simply because of the complexity of his thought and prose, but also because he set the bar for translation impossibly high. In his often quoted essay, The Task of the Translator, we read that our duty is nothing less than to recover an Ursprache, a pure primal language that becomes weighed down with, quote, heavy alien meaning, end quote, in terrestrial works of literature. The translator, in Harry Zone's version of the essay, is, quote, to release in his own language that pure language which is under the spell of another, to liberate the language imprisoned in a work in his recreation of that work. For the sake of pure language, he breaks through decayed barriers of his own language, end quote. While this does wonders for translators' egos and sense of mission, it's not much practical help in overcoming language barriers, decayed or not. When working on a collection of Benjamin's essays, edited by Samuel Tighton and organized around his central storyteller essay, I had to disentangle Benjamin's evolving use of Erfahrung and Erlebnis, two words for which English only has one, experience. The concept of experience, whether gained directly or secondhand, is fundamental to Benjamin's view of storytelling as an essential locus of meaning in human life. Both Erfahrung and Erlebnis have impressive pedigrees in philosophy and phenomenology, originating with Aristotle and developed by Bacon, Husserl, Hegel, Kant, Bergson, and others. Nonetheless, these concepts can, according to the Dictionary of Untranslatables, be understood in line with their etymologies. I'd like to point out here that the editors of the indispensable philosophical lexicon of untranslatables take great pains to stress that they're not claiming the many entries in the dictionary cannot be translated, but rather that these terms have so far resisted adequate translation, and this resistance is a source of nuance and insight. So, etymologically, Erlebnis is based on the root word Leben or life and connotes immediate lived experience. Erfahrung is based on the root word fahren, to go or to travel, and refers to the kind of experience and knowledge that is gained on a journey, from an encounter or from another's experience and observations. Erfahrung can be acquired directly or learned secondhand, and so can be shared in a more profound sense than an Erlebnis can. Benjamin's contribution to the understanding and use of these terms was to associate them with Bergson's theory of memory. He connects Erfahrung with Gedächtnis, or memory in general, and Erlebnis with Erinnerung, an interiorized subjective form of memory usually translated into English as recollection. But Benjamin's association of these different kinds of experience in memory was not always rigorous. As Kevin McLaughlin points out in the Dictionary of Untranslatables, quote, the specific connection between experience and memory in Benjamin's theory of Erfahrung is articulated through his manipulation of these four terms, for which English equivalents have proven elusive. So where does that leave his translator? To me, it felt like standing on quicksand. One of the shorter, slipperier pieces from the story collection is a reflection on Proverbs. As you'll see, in one sentence, I had to narrow down the terms Erfahrung and Erlebnis according to my interpretation of the role they're playing, not only in that particular sentence, but also in the context of Benjamin's thought. So, on Proverbs. Take as a foundation the image of women carrying full heavy vessels on their heads without using their hands. The rhythm in which they do this is what the proverb demonstrates. A noli me tangere of experience speaks from the proverb, and through this, the proverb declares its ability to transform experience into tradition. Proverbs cannot be applied to a specific situation. Rather, they have a kind of magical character. They transform the situation. An individual hardly has the capacity to cleanse all the traces of personal experience from the lessons learned in life. But Proverbs can do this by appropriating those lessons. They turn knowledge gained from experience into a wave in the endless breathing chain of life lessons that come to us from eternity. In the seventh sentence, reducing Erlebnis to lessons learned in life and erlebte Erfahrung to knowledge gained from experience is a necessary evil. It is a kind of betrayal, but one done in good faith and after a great deal of anguish and research. Publishers of literary translations rarely allow footnotes or endnotes to alert readers to the array of meanings in a single word or phrase, so I had to incorporate my interpretation of Benjamin's intentions in using these terms, keeping in mind that general readers, not scholars, were my intended audience. And of course, in his translation, no single word stands alone. I decided to translate lehrt das Sprichwort as what the proverb demonstrates rather than what the proverb teaches, because the latter would tie the proverb too closely to the Erlebnis 3 paragraphs later. Proverbs in this text teach by example, whereas life experiences teach lessons directly. It's easy to get lost in such weeds, but preserving nuance depends on not overlooking these weeds. In one last example, I'd like to look at incompatible verb tenses or moods. The subjunctive mood was commonly used in Old English, much as it is in German, to cast doubt on the truth of a proposition or express unreality, wishes, requests, and commands, or to indicate reported speech. However, it began to wither in Middle English as inflectional endings were leveled and verb forms were simplified. Middle English, incidentally, is bounded by the Norman conquest in 1066 and 1476, the year the first printing press was set up in England. The subjunctive plays an essential role in the novel Angel of Oblivion by the Austrian writer Maja Haderlap. Haderlap was born into the Slovenian-speaking community in Carinthia, Austria's southernmost province. She initially wrote poetry in Slovenian but turned to German, the main language of her education, to write this work, a decision that was very harshly judged by a contingent of Austrian Slovenes who are, understandably, very possessive of their history. But had she not written the novel in German, its audience would have been extremely limited, and Angel of Oblivion would not have changed the domestic conversation about Austria's past as it most certainly has. This novel is based on the experiences of her family and her community, many of whom fought as partisans against the Nazis during the Second World War and suffered resentment and suspicion from the German-speaking majority in the decades after. It's also the story of a young girl learning to navigate the treacherous terrain between two hostile communities and two extremely burdened languages, Slovenian, a language of heroic resistance and continued humiliation suffered, and German, a way out of her stifling rural upbringing, but also the language of the camps which her grandmother barely survived and many family members did not. Angel of Oblivion is both a study of the fragility and malleability of collective memory in embattled minority communities and a testament to the power of storytelling. As she listens to the erratic and sometimes jumbled narratives of relatives and neighbors, the narrator, as a girl, realizes they are not actual storytellers, but fast Erzähler, or almost storytellers, whose stories crumble to pieces in their minds. As the narrator grows older, she gradually retrieves her community's past from the abyss of history and begins to understand the complexity of that past and its echoes in present-day Corinthia. Even so, her sense of identity is inextricably bound up with the stories heard secondhand and the trauma of others. And this is where the subjunctive becomes an essential element of the narrative. The narrator constantly alternates between her own memories and those of others, between direct and indirect speech. The narrative is rhythmically punctuated by references to the sources of those stories or the information being related. Sagt Großmutter, sagt Vater, sagt Tonchi, or wie man erzählt. Grandmother says, father says, Tonchi says, or as they say. There are also shifts between the indicative and the conjunctive one, along with abrupt pronominal jumps that embody the narrator's inability to put distance between herself and her family's history. These were all but impossible to capture in English. In an early passage, the narrator recalls doing chores with her grandmother, which were always accompanied by a stream of recollections. In this case, I'll read the German because rhythm is essential to the narrative voice in this novel. Sie sagt, sie habe auch Essen gestohlen für sich und die anderen. Sie habe nach jeder Kartoffelschale gesucht, nach allem, was essbar schien, damals, als sie die Kessel gewaschen hat. Das war noch ein Glück, sagt sie, dass sie dahin gekommen sei, in die Küche, im Lager, ich weiß. The girl's inability to distance her own from her grandmother's perspective is encapsulated in the constant switching from the conjunctive one, habe, to the indicative, das war noch ein Glück, back to the conjunctive, sei, and again, not only to the indicative, but to her own perspective, ich weiß. All this is inevitably flattened out in English. She tells me she also stole food for herself and the others. She kept an eye out for every single potato peel, for anything that looked edible, back then, when she washed the cauldrons. It was great luck, she says, that she ended up in the kitchen, in the camp. I know. One way I tried to make up for the flattening effect of translation was to reproduce, if not stress, the variable rhythms of Maya's sentences. Translation is an opportunity to stress test a language and invigorate it. Elliot Weinberger has noted that many of the golden ages in literature have been, not coincidentally, periods of active and prolific translation. Not only are new genres, styles, and forms imported into a receptive literary tradition, but the host language itself gains in expressive tools and techniques. As Weinberger pointed out, quote, translation liberates the translation language, because a translation will always be read as something foreign. It is freed from the many constraints of the currently accepted norms and conventions in the national literature. Think of American modernism in the early 20th century, end quote. Think of American modernism in the early 20th century or German literature at the turn of the 19th, and consider echoes of Thomas Bernhardt's irascible narrators and W.G. Sebald's melancholy wanderers in contemporary Anglophone literature. Translation is, by definition, an exercise in building bridges between individuals and communities. Susan Sontag saw literary translation as an ethical task, quote, one that mirrors and duplicates the role of literature itself, which is to extend our sympathies, to secure and deepen the awareness, with all its consequences, that other people different from us really do exist, end quote. I believe that in order for us to understand that people different from us really do exist, not only in alien cultures, but in cultures that share many of our own values and our history, we must be exposed to their underlying assumptions and their thought processes. Several books that I've translated have made me uncomfortable. Early in my career, I translated the novel 100 Days by the Swiss writer Lukas Bärfuß. It charts the emotional and moral collapse of David Hole, a Swiss aid development worker in Rwanda who falls in love with a Hutu woman shortly before the outbreak of the genocide. When he is spurned by this woman, who leaves him to lead a particularly vicious death squad, Hole's previously latent racism and misogyny surface. For several months during the editorial process, it was not clear if some of the more offensive passages, a total of 4 or 5 pages, would be cut in the English edition. Translators, I should point out, do not always have the final say in the edited version, but that's a topic for another day. In the end, 100 Days was published unexpurgated because it was clear that these passages are a crucial element of the novel's stinging critique of the willful blindness displayed by some humanitarian and soft diplomacy issues sponsored by wealthy countries whose governments are too arrogant or lazy to examine the unintended or indirect consequences of the programs they fund. Had this critique been defanged, Bärfuß's novel would have been less offensive and more pleasant to read, but then its effectiveness in provoking readers to examine both their own assumptions and motives and those of their government institutions would have been blunted. 100 Days, complete with the objectionable passages, was eventually shortlisted for a major translation prize, but I'm still left with a lingering sense of discomfort. I suspect this novel would not survive today's sensitivity readers. It's difficult and dangerous to make prescriptive rules about what should or should not be softened or smoothed over in translation. There are still many cases in which offensive language is used in indulgent, irresponsible, harmful, and ignorant ways. And yet we can't paper over or wish away our differences or the uglier aspects of our histories. Isabel Kohl has written of her experience translating the fiction of the East German writer Wolfgang Hilbig, with multiple passages that, quote, contain the toxic history of male hysteria, which a generation of young feminists is struggling to dismantle word by word, end quote. Her unease was provoked less by the fraught language itself than by her editor's expectation that she would tame the characters' voices or cover them with a smooth kind of membrane. She points out the dangers of eliminating the friction that arises from exposure to views radically different from our own. Quote, the proposition of frictionless identification can be a dead end, not just for the reader, but also and especially for the translator. The assumption of innate affinity can cause blindness, make it all too easy to project yourself onto the other. You end up standing in your own way, end quote. How much insight into the darker urges all humans are subject to can we afford to sacrifice for our comfort? In order to understand ourselves and others, we have to know where we and they are coming from. Each case involving charged or offensive language must be evaluated individually according to the language's function and effect in the text. In my remarks this evening, I hope I've shown that in translation, context is all. We ignore context, familiar or foreign, at our peril. David Bellows succinctly sums up the case for translation, warts and all, in Is That a Fish in Your Ear? His study of translation, with the assertion, quote, translating is a first step towards civilization, end quote. After all, translation depends on communication between disparate groups of people, especially those that are mutually hostile. Absent communication, there can be no hope of common ground. Although indispensable, translation is a provisional, precarious endeavor. If the bridges translation builds resemble delicate suspension bridges rather than sturdy stone constructions, it does not mean that they are any less essential or trustworthy. Thank you.
So, thank you for that wonderful talk, and I hope we can kind of spin the threads a bit further, or unravel them, or both.
Weave them back together.
I wanted to, maybe to kick things off, as long as the questions might be coming in, I wanted to go back to one of your translation metaphors, or one of your reflections on what we can see translation as, that I mentioned in my introduction, this idea of translation as an act of responsibility that you expressed in a conversation with publisher Naveen Kishore of Seagull Books. And I was really struck in that conversation how you kind of uncovered different layers of the word responsibility and how that might apply to translation. I was wondering if maybe you could start by going into that a bit as kind of maybe the other side of the coin of betrayal.
as some of you know, because we've talked about this before, I'm fascinated by etymology and historical or semantic history, because I believe that words carry their histories with them. If you just look at the root words and understand the accretions and the way they change over time depending on use. And the root word of responsibility, of course, is respond, which in Latin has meanings both answering to and answering for, and taking ownership of. It has connotations of duty and task. And so to me, this is a word that captures in many aspects of translation, because you're not just serving the work, you're serving and answering to the work and performing, have duties and responsibilities for the work for what you make of the work in the other language. So I do like to think of translation as an act of responsibility, because you are responding to your reading of it and yet also answering for that reading that you make manifest on the page.
I think that was an interesting... okay, I have a question coming in, so I'll...
Ready.
Let's see. Question for both Tess and Isabel. In your experience, what are publishers' most common arguments for not including translators' names on book covers? What leverage do you and the text's original authors, and perhaps also those readers, have to counter those arguments?
Do you want to go first, or should I?
I can't really think the publishers that I've had that didn't put my name on the cover, and that was actually only at the very beginning, because since then I've been fortunate in my publishers. That came at a time when I didn't really feel up to responding to such things, and so I didn't call that into question, so I didn't get any arguments for why they were doing it, of course. So
I have been on the receiving end of why it's dangerous to put the translator's name on the cover. And that is, there's not enough room for it, even though, they put all sorts of other text on it, or that it will frighten readers away. If they see it's a translated book, they won't buy it. Also, that it's unimportant. And this was said by a publisher who translated himself from French. Jennifer Croft, who is, among others, Olga Tokarczuk's translator, took a very brave stand recently. You probably read about it in the New York Times. And she said, I refuse now to work with any publishers who won't put my name on the cover. And, that's wonderful. She is of a stature that she can do this. It may not be possible for a translator who's starting out, but she's leading by example, and that's wonderful. Most contracts now include a clause saying that the translator's name shall be on the cover, but it rarely specifies which cover. So my name is on the cover of those 6 books, but just not always visible, particularly visible.
So do read the fine print in your contracts.
Yeah. But this is, I think, one of the problems is that it's such an ingrained attitude, it will take a very long time to change. The USC, the University in Southern California, was given a huge grant recently to start a prize for translated fiction. Mid-career fiction written in any language. And the press release in the LA Times noted all the judges, they noted all the sponsors, they noted the advisors to the people who were founding the prize, they noted the author's name, but they didn't once mention the translator, who I happen to know put a great deal of effort into finding a publisher for this particular author, and he would not have been available in English without her efforts. And yet, the only place you could see her name was a picture of the cover of one of the books because she translated it for Archipelago Books, who have faithfully put translators' names on the cover. So,
I think you're touching on another important question, tangential to our theme tonight, but just this issue of translators as active conveyors of literature, translators as discoverers of literature. And I kind of wonder if there's maybe an unease about the idea that translators are so active, or that you have to rely on translators to choose what gets transported.
I think that's an element of the suspicion with which translators are considered generally. But another element is simply ignorance. People just assume that the books are translated fiction. Oh, the publisher chooses it and then it happens. Often, translators have championed that particular writer for years. In the case of Jenny Croft and Olga Tokarczuk, I think she shopped the book around for a decade or more, 15 years. Yeah, so it's an ingrained attitude that I think will take a long time to change. And we welcome questions from you, too. Yeah? Lawrence?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about the challenges of translating living authors as opposed to authors who have died, and if they represent different challenges, and if there's different levels of freedom in the field.
It depends entirely. Oh, okay.
I'm going to repeat that.
Should he repeat the question for the on? Okay.
Tess. Tess. I was wondering if you could comment on the differences in translating a living author as opposed to an author who is not alive, if it presents different challenges.
It presents different challenges, but it also presents different opportunities. So, on the one hand, if your author is dead, you're kind of on your own trying to figure out what he or she meant. But then also you can kind of, use your best judgment and go with that. With living authors, particularly when translating from German, they often know English reasonably well, if not very well. Yeah, Katie's laughing. So sometimes you will get an author who wants to question every word. Why did you use this one? Because, one standard example is the German word Haus means house and building. And so, but, you can't say, like, I went to my, a 30-floor apartment house. I went to my 30-floor house. You have to say, I went to my 30-story apartment building. And so I had one author where, in a sentence, every sentence there was a word that, well, why this and not that? And I was cutting and pasting dictionary definitions. And I said, well, yes, the first meaning is this, but there are 6 or 7 meanings that actually fit better. So after about 10 dictionary entries, that stopped. But primarily, those are actually the exceptions. I've had very generous authors who, if I have a question, I say, well, here's a problematic passage that maybe it doesn't work so well in an English language context, or you've got a word that has these 3 meanings and I can only catch these 2 or those 2, which do you want? They say, do what you want, and if you want to add something, if you want to rewrite, then that's fine. So it's hard to generalize because there are very different language levels and also different, some authors are more possessive of their literal works than others.
If I could just follow up, if you're saying... If you're saying that the best authors are the ones that you most like working with are the ones who say, do what you want, doesn't it suggest that you just as soon push a button, have them all dead?
No, I'd much rather I would say my vast, overwhelming experience of working with living authors has been hugely helpful to, for example, with Kaft, there were all sorts of, first of all, there were all his complicated jokes that I needed help teasing out sometimes, or references to the minutiae of German politics in the 80s and 90s that I had no idea about. And so to figure out what was going on. And one of the problems in the book, for example, was the use of the word liberal. Liberal here means something very different from liberal in the United States. And so figuring out how to change those terms, whether it's free market or neoliberal or laissez-faire, so I'd welcome that help. So I like them live. Okay. Yeah, Damian. Oh, sorry.
Now I'm confused.
Yes, I was wondering if you ever translated an author who had been translated before you translated, and how you positioned yourself in relationship not just to the author but the other translations.
I did. I just translated Ernst Jünger's On the Marble Cliffs, which was translated by Stuart Hood in 47, I think. So I looked at Hood's version initially. The publisher asked me to do it. It wasn't my idea. I looked at the first translation to see whether it was worth improving on, or whether I read the original differently enough to make it worth the effort. And then I didn't read any more, because even if I would read it and put it aside, the phrases get in your mind, and I was worried about copying more than I realized, or copying at all, certainly unconsciously. I have to admit, though, when there were some very tricky passages, I would take a peek to figure out what I was missing.
Tess, thanks for a great talk. I love the Borges anecdote, and it reminded me of a comment someone once made to me that Scott Moncrief's translation of Proust was better than the original. Now, that is kind of a mind-bending idea, because we have, I think, a natural assumption that there's the original, and a lot of what you talked about was how this is not true, but there's the original, and the translator's job is to get as close to that as possible on the graph, and it's asymptotic. They could never get there, when in fact, there are going to be a bunch of different ones. But I'm curious if you have ever encountered any space in which someone would say, yeah, maybe that translation is better than the original, or a translator ought to take the text and make it a better piece of literature. I don't know. What is this a subversive thought for the whole industry?
No, it is a matter of debate. Garcia Marquez did say that Gregory Rabas's 100 Years of Solitude was better than the original, and meant it. He wasn't just being flattering. I just find it hard to quantify as better, different in a good way, maybe. But it's such a subjective thing. There's the endless debate about which Proust translation is best. And even though the Moncrief has many mistakes, it captures the atmosphere in a way that many of the other more correct ones don't. So I am sure it's possible that some translations are better than the original on a sort of objective level, but who's to say? I'm not gonna take that plunge.
Thank you, Tess. You talked about the translator's name not fitting on the book cover. I'm trying to solidify my thoughts here. I'm thinking that when I grew up, there's so many regions in the world that when we are looking at the West literature, it's known that it's translated, and those knowledge comes to us as a kind of like a window to the world and the pathway to be at the beat of the world. And so that we actually have so many authors taking the liberty. Like when I read the Tales of Genji, it was translated by this author, very famed author who actually worked with translator's team, and he actually took liberty of writing himself, but it was so close, and I reread the Lovers by Margaret Duras in both English and French, but I read it in Chinese before. But I got that everything was the same. What I'm trying to ask here is actually, do you know anything about what's the new phenomenon of translating the non-Western authors? Because I actually see there are so many writers that I know that aren't available in U.S. markets, and only a few are available, and far in between, and we're having this like huge debate with the countries and the country's thought, but without knowing the literature minds. I wonder what's the translators. I don't know what's the question. I think the question is. What is the current pause from the translators' field, translating from the non-Western language? Perhaps that's the question.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's very much a problem. You know, in my talk, I make claims about how important it is to understand other countries' assumptions and to get a sense of people who are different from we are. And it's impossible to do through literature if there's no access to that literature. Asian literatures are woefully non-represented in the publishing world. Part of that has to do with which languages get funding to be, which countries have cultural institutions that will help fund translations, because even successful translations often will be a loss without funding from government or foundations, bodies. There are, though, recently a number of publishers who have been founded specifically to translate Asian, Far East, Near East voices. Tilted Axis Press in England. Amazon Crossing does a large percentage of Chinese literature that otherwise doesn't appear, because they're also open to genre books. Do you know of others?
I do know that apparently there is more Chinese science fiction being translated in the past couple of years. There was one Chinese science fiction writer who was very, I can't remember the name.
Was it the three-body problem?
For a while. I think that was it, yeah. Yes. And that kind of opened the doors in science fiction, which has a big problem that very little is translated in genres in science fiction. And although that's unfortunate because it's an important literary current, but it's been I think there are certain movements in the science fiction field to open up more toward translation, and there's more openness also to Asian science fiction.
And how curated are they? Like, who curates which writers?
Often it's, of my friends who translate into Chinese or from Chinese.
Not just the Chinese.
Yeah, but also Japanese and Indonesian, various Indian languages. Those are literatures that are much more dependent on the efforts of the translators to place the books with houses than the Western languages that have sort of a familiar literary tradition. Familiar and proven to not lose too much money. But I was just thinking also about the standing of the translator and whether they're on the cover or not. Some of you will know in Japan, there's something like a dozen words for translators because they have a word for a translator, of a new work, a translator who does retranslations, and there is always, as far I've been told by my friends who translate from Japanese, translators are granted much more respect, and there are actually many more people who will buy books in Japan based on who translated them than, yeah.
That's what I meant to.
Yeah. I think, like foreign authors, there seems to be, room for one or two prominent names in the Anglophone world at any given time, whether it's Roberto Bolaño or Elena Ferrante. Sometimes a translator will get a fair amount of attention and they'll be interested in Ferrante, so they'll read everything that Anne Goldstein translates, for example. But there seems to be a very small attention span for that kind of fame or interest, more interest than fame. So.
Got another question in the chat here. Translators in the 17th and 18th centuries felt free to recreate more than actually rendering the original. Would you know when and why translating became so ill-received?
Yeah, I mean, the standard case is the 1001 Nights, which is basically, it's purported to be a translation, but it's actually a compilation of folk tales. I know that David Bellos has written an article about this, and it has to do with the institution of copyright. And once in France, but I'm afraid I didn't read. I didn't have time. I was too busy reading the headlines. I didn't read that essay. So the short answer is it has to do with the institution of copyright in France in the 1800s. Google David Bellos, and he will explain it all.
Well, copyright always spoils all the fun.
Yes. Delphine had a question. Oh yeah, sorry, Lucy.
Thanks very much for your talk. It was really, really inspiring. And I keep coming back to part of it, which was about Lukas Bärfuß and how you felt that you went back and forth on a decision about whether to leave offensive language in because you felt it was integral to the character. And I'd like to just also bring Isabella in on, because I didn't read the article that you wrote, but I think I've heard of it. But the idea that the translator has a huge amount of responsibility in a very sensitive area of language, and it can't escape us that many of the readers that we are also translating for are people who will be directly affected by their experience and will bring their experience to the text and won't have that kind of intellectual distance from the text to not feel aggressed or simply just be lost as an audience. And I just want to sort of, that's not really a question, but I'd really like to hear how you approach those kinds of decisions in your translation work.
Do you want to go first, or should I?
I guess I just, as a writer and a translator, I feel that if it's important to tackle dark issues, I don't see how you can do that and avoid using dark language. And I'm not sure that, I don't approve of using offensive language to provoke, and it's, a question of judgment, whether that's what you see in the text. But I guess I have very fundamental issues with the idea of softening or of avoiding, painful language if we're talking about painful issues. And Kafka said a text should be like an axe for the frozen sea of the soul. Literature can hurt, and and you don't know what is going to hurt someone. So I guess I have a very strong tendency against wanting to make these judgments and assume. I had a kind of unformed question, or hard to articulate question, on this issue of betrayal and trust, which I was thinking about with the Bärfuß, is, in a sense, if you have a question like that, you're sort of, in a sense, divided between betraying the sense of betraying the author by changing their work, or betraying the reader by assuming that the reader will be hurt by the work. And I think that's also a big burden to put on the translator, and maybe shifting a burden of other larger issues onto the translator and asking them to negotiate it. Mm-hmm. But okay, that's kind of a large question.
Yeah, I'm aligned with Isabel on this. It really has to be a case-by-case basis. And so I felt that 100 Days should be published as it was. And, it was more the publishing house that was objecting to those passages, which I do think could well be harmful to a number of people. But my thinking about it, which I hope was actually sort of a sharp analysis and not rationalization, was that the function of that language, of those passages, was to in fact show how despicable the character was. And by eliminating that, you ended up feeling, he's kind of a jerk. But he was truly despicable, and what he was, in the context of this novel, was a reflection of the Swiss politicians who took all sorts of credit for sending this development aid to Rwanda, and yet what they were doing was funding the radio stations that were then, provoking the genocide, because nobody had bothered to learn Kinyarwanda. So this was actually based on a real situation. It's difficult and squishy, and so once you say, well, you've got to figure out what the intent is, it leaves open the door to abuses and misuses. But I'm afraid it's eliminating it, having a blanket sort of censorship is worse. But there are plenty of books that shouldn't be translated at all, because they, as a whole, are harmful, I think. There's interesting work being done on whether language can be decolonized in the translation process by Danmi Choi, who is from Korea, and she feels that she can be more intrusive in the way she translates her Korean authors into English, and refusing to use certain terms because those were terms imposed on her nation, nation divided by an imperial power, by the United States. And but that's such a history-specific case that she feels she can do that with impunity. And another one is Johannes Göransson at Notre Dame wrote about transgressive circulation, about how there can be transgressive forces in translation that can sort of wipe away these things, scrape away. I mean, his language is a bit more violent and justified. But again, those are specific cases, and it's hard to apply that to all. What I'm very wary of is cleaning up works of the past. People won't necessarily take the time, especially if they're offended, to read a foreword or a translator's note. Miriam Mandelkau, who translates James Baldwin into German, has some very interesting thoughts on what language does she use, Black, Negro, harder words. And she decided to follow what Baldwin used about himself, whether it's the English term or the German equivalent, whether it's schwarz or black, because when there wasn't a direct equivalent, I believe she kept the English terms, so as not to mix two unfortunate cultural histories. But it's worth reading her afterwards too. She has one coming out soon, and the last one was Notes of a Native Son. Delphine.
Tess, thank you so much for this wonderful and really thought-inducing talk. My question really segues nicely from what you've just said. A little while back, there was some controversy over the choice of one of the translators for Amanda Gorman's poetry collection. One of the translators was, I believe, not African American, and there were, I think there were concerns mixed in. So there were different layers of concerns. One is the lack of representation of minorities in the cultural sphere generally, but there were also concerns that someone who did not share the lived experience in this very political moment of poetry that had taken on a lot of political significance could not faithfully, whatever that means, translate her work. And so I was really curious what you thought about that, and how much, if translation is all about context, how much context do you need to share with who you're translating, and whether this might not be a counter argument for publishers that if you want to be, rather than hiding how much or how little context a translator might share with the author, shouldn't that be sort of up front and center? And shouldn't we have a photograph of the translator and a bio and something about what your relationship is with the work, as in the case of that Korean American translator?
Do you want to take that one? That situation was a mess. It was such a lost opportunity. The publisher, the Dutch publisher, commissioned Marika Reinfeldt, whose work had just won the Booker, I think the International Booker, or they, as a non-binary author with name recognition. They thought, well, this will be an interesting, lucrative publication. There was a black journalist said, really? I mean, nothing against this writer, but couldn't a translator of color be found in the Netherlands? And then it just turned into a mess where people were repeating things that weren't said and blowing things out of proportion. I see it as, insisting on the translator's identity is a failure of imagination. And in this case, it would have been
instantaneity, maybe. I wonder, I would like to hear more about this comparison that is not obvious.
I think the one thing that I've been thinking about in comparing photography and translation is the fact that, a picture tells 1,000 words. A picture, so much depends on the interpretation of the viewer. And a picture its meaning can change drastically if the viewer has information about what's going on in it. Say there's a mouth open and an expressive, open-mouthed expressively. Is that a scream? Is it delight? Is it laughter? You don't necessarily know without the context. And so what was interesting to me about comparing photography to translation is that the translator approaches the original text and it's a very subjective process. You are fundamentally only translating your reading or interpretation of it. And so I would actually think, all text should be translated multiple times so that you can sort of narrow in from different angles to see what you might miss. Yeah, photography is also an incomplete art in the sense that it's just a moment in time, and I don't always think that the factor of time in understanding a translation is necessarily taken into account as often as it should be. You know, when you read a book, an original or a translation, you know, one day and then you read it 10 years later, it's a different process. A different understanding, it's a different book, and you're a different person. And so all of a sudden, you know, what is the saying? Like, you put a book out into the world, it's actually, and it has 10,000 readers, it's actually 10,000 books. But if you think about a translation, then it's that many more, because it's the book, now you've got those 10,000 readers, and then you have 10,000 in a completely different context. So those are also different books. So I don't know if that answers your question. Oh, that's it.
Let me thank both Isabel and Tess for an incredible discussion, Tess for a great lecture, and now I'm going to think twice every time I open up a book in translation, maybe more than twice. Anyway, I just want to let everyone know that our next event will be the Axel Springer Lecture a week from today, Thursday, March 10th, in which Javiera Barandiaran will explore the past, current, and perhaps future debates surrounding the role of lithium and its producers as the world looks to a post-carbon future, and what the future of lithium itself might look like, lithium extraction, that is. For more information, please do look at our website. I hope to see many of you at that event. I think it's going to be great. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabel.